Our speaker today is Matt Leacock. I first met Matt about 10 years ago when we both joined a group that plays board games every Wednesday night. And I quickly discovered that Matt not only likes to play games, he also likes to design them because he was asking me to help playtest some of his designs. In February of this year, Matt released Pandemic, which is a board game where players cooperate to save the world from deadly diseases that threaten to wipe out humanity. The game has been enthusiastically received, and its first printing sold out in less than a month. In his day job, Matt is a principal designer at Yahoo, and I think in this talk, to try to pull together these two areas of interest, Matt's going to discuss how being an interaction designer affected the game design process, as well as how cooperative games like Pandemic can point to new models for engagement in online systems. So without further delay, here's Matt.
I want to thank Dave for having me out. As you mentioned, I'm Matt Leacock. I want to point out, first and foremost, I'm a hobbyist game designer. I don't actually design games for a living. They just don't pay the bills. Maybe if you're doing computer games, you can get away with it. But I'm, as you mentioned, an interaction designer. And I draw a lot from my hobby and from my profession. Although designing board games doesn't pay the bills, I get a lot of inspiration from it that I can apply to interaction design. And I learn a lot in the interaction design process that I use at work that I can apply then to board game design. So when Dave invited me out, I thought maybe I could dig a little bit into that because it might be of interest to you guys. Let's see if I can get my... there we go. So this is what I have kind of laid out. I thought I'd give a little brief overview of Pandemic for people who've never played the game or seen it, and then go through the development history a bit and talk about some of the lessons I learned from the game. And then very briefly kind of compare that to software design. And then leave some time at the end for Q&A. Does that sound workable? So first of all, has anybody out there played the game? Okay, we got maybe a third. Oh, and someone brought one. Great. So I try not to bore you guys, but give the rest of the audience some sort of idea of how the game works in about 2 minutes, if I can. So first of all, as Dave mentioned, Pandemic is a cooperative game. Unlike most games when you're fighting head-to-head with the other players in the game, in Pandemic you're all working together as a team. And you're working as a team essentially to try to beat the game. Either everybody all wins together or they all lose together. And this is a shot of the game in play, or maybe right after the game is finished. And so the idea is you're moving your pawns around, and you're trying to contain disease that's outbreaking across the planet. And you're trying to contain them so that you can buy enough time to research 4 cures. There's 4 diseases there: red, blue, yellow, and black. And you need to get those cures before the world erupts in disease, essentially. So on your turn, you've got 4 actions you can spend. And most of your time is spent just basically moving around the board trying to contain things. But one of the more important actions there is discovering a cure. So once you've done that discover action 4 times and discovered the 4 cures, you save the world and everybody feels great. If, however, you don't, then other things happen. So after you take your 4 actions, you actually draw 2 cards, and then it's your job to infect the world some more. And you do that by drawing these cards. This is an infection card. So at the end of your turn, you draw an infection card. This one's for Algiers. You'd play this card, and then you take a black cube representing an infected population, and you put that in Algiers. And you draw another card, and you put some more cubes on, and so on. And then from time to time, so basically the play proceeds. You take some actions, you infect the board, you take some actions, you infect the board. From time to time, you're going to draw one of these, and this is the nasty card in the game, an epidemic card. And when you draw one of these, lots of bad things happen. Amongst them, you end up taking all these disease cards that you were pulling, and you take the discard pile, all the different places that have been infected. You take that and you shuffle it up, and then you put it back on top of the draw pile. And that has this horrible side effect that means that as you're infecting the world again, when you draw new infections, the cities that were previously infected get increasingly more infected. And after a while, you might end up in a situation like this where you can see Europe is overrun with the case of the blue meanies, or whatever you want to call the blue disease. And it's really bad because the cities actually can only hold a certain amount of infection. After they after they get so saturated, if you add any more infected people to that, it outbreaks into the neighboring regions. So in this case, if you were to add another cube to Paris rather than adding a fourth cube, it would outbreak to all of its neighbors, and you would have to add a cube into each one of those cities. And if those had 3 cubes in them, they would outbreak. And you can kind of see how you get these vicious chain reactions, and things get out of hand. And if you get too many of those, then basically humanity's wiped out, and it's your fault, basically. However, if you're able to collect 5 cards of the same color, in this case blue, and turn them in, you're able to find the cure, in this case for blue, and you mark it on the board. And should you and your team be able to discover the 4 different cures, you win, and the world is saved, and there's high fives all around. One last thing I want to point out about the game is that each player has a specific role that they play, something unique that they bring to the team. And you can be a dispatcher, ops expert, medic, researcher, that sort of thing. And that allows you to sort of bring your own unique contribution. Although you're all cooperating, each player has sort of an opportunity to shine. So that's sort of a pandemic in a nutshell. So I thought I'd look a little bit at the history, with the process I went to design the game and some of the things I picked up as I went. So I want to touch very briefly on idea generation, because I always asked, where did the idea for the game come from? And for the longest time, I had to kind of say, I really don't know. It just kind of sprang forth. And honestly, that's really not true. After thinking about it, or maybe rationalizing it for a while, I remembered that when I was a teenager, I came up with one of my earlier games, and it was a kind of a goofy concept where you were represented in the game by a subatomic particle. And you played another opponent who was another particle. And your goal was to smash yourself as much as possible so that you started out basically with a chip. And you wanted to smash yourself, so you became 2 chips. And then you could smash those, and you'd have 4, and then 8, and 16. You could kind of get the idea that things would get rapidly out of control. And so the game had this horrible name. So you get the idea. You get subatomic particles, fission, right? And all the pieces were chips. So, of course, the name of the game was Fission Chips. I'll let you... Anyway, so I had that kind of in the back of my head, and I also wanted to do a cooperative game. And when you're doing a cooperative game, you need to kind of embody an opponent, and viruses seemed like a natural. And also, so I'm trying to think what else kind of piled into that. Well, I guess all the news, all the news, all the different pandemics, SARS and such happening. So I was out on a walk with my daughter, and I think a lot of this stuff was floating around in my head. You think of all sorts of things when you're walking a 2-year-old. And came back and quickly sketched out what is essentially an undirected graph, I guess, and labeled each of the vertices with a number or a jack, queen, king, as you can see here. Basically, what I wanted to do was test out the core kernel of an idea that I had for how I could make a game of chain reactions on the Earth due to viruses happen. And so I sketched this together in maybe, 15 minutes, grabbed some cubes, grabbed some pawns, and a standard deck of cards, and played it a couple times myself, and brought my wife in, and we played a couple. And it's kind of hard to convince your wife to play something on something that looks like this, but she was actually willing to suspend disbelief. And right away, I came up with, kind of accidentally discovered that mechanic that I mentioned, where you shovel the discard and put it back on top, and had kind of a core of an idea here, and kind of a hook that I thought was solid. And it's interesting that when I look back at the sketch, a lot of the rules that are written on the margins are actually made it all the way to the published game. So after getting that sort of core, I moved it into Illustrator and quickly grabbed some map and threw an overlay on it. And I want to point out that, just still trying to keep it rough. One of the things I've learned is that if you try to polish a prototype too early, you become married to it, and you don't want to make changes. So there's no city names on here. These cities really could be anywhere, but I threw them on. And again, you've got queen and king on there. I didn't want to produce a special deck for the game. So the takeaways, I guess, I've got from this are that it's important to keep things really simple and raw when you're starting out. And it might actually be better to explain this by providing some counterexamples. I designed a racing game, I think 10 years ago, and it took me 10 years of iteration before I was happy with it. And the reason was I was so happy with this concept that I made this complete set right out of the gate before even playing it, refined it really, I had this polished prototype, and would play it, and then it would be like, yeah, it's kind of fun, and you do some incremental changes, but you really don't know what the core of the game is, and you end up iterating forever, kind of aimlessly. So I've got a number of games under my belt like that, where you just don't know when to stop because you don't necessarily have a goal. You don't know where the core of it is. The second thing to touch on is just how important iteration is. So I started with this simple game, came up with a simple version of an Illustrator, and then as I played it once or twice, I would end up with additional iterations. I think I had like 20 of these boards, maybe about a half dozen different decks of cards as I was trying to refine the rule set before finally coming up with working with the publisher on the final edition. So this is a process of about 4 years, sort of the occasional weekend or night. And I guess just to reinforce what I said before, you really need to have a goal. I think the big learning here was that when I designed Pandemic, I really had a crisp goal. I wanted a game that could be played in about 45 minutes, and I wanted a game that I could play with my wife. That was the thing. You play with, if I play with my spouse, you end up in these contentious situations where I don't know, some of you are nodding. You end up in you don't feel good at the end of the game, right? So I basically had a muse. I had a game that I wanted to play quickly. It had some chain reactions in it, and at the end of the day, at the end of the game, I would feel good after playing it. And without something like that, you end up just hopelessly iterating. The next one is actually pretty straightforward, around accessibility and trying to reduce the amount of friction that your game has in it. I showed you an early prototype where I've got red and green. Well, surprise, surprise, I play tested this with a coworker, and it turned out, he just basically said, I can't play this. I'm colorblind, and this is just kind of a non-starter. And I guess in retrospect, this is obvious. You want to avoid these sorts of things, but when you think about mass market games and the four colors that are inevitably in any set, you got your blue, you got your yellow, you got your red, and you got your green. And the publishers are just cutting out up to 10% of their population from the get-go. So that was an important lesson. So one iteration here shows that I've taken that into account. The colors here are safe for colorblind, and they're also double coded. So you've got red plus a symbol and black plus a symbol. So if you can't even make out the color, you can at least make sense of it. And you can see here that the red drops out, but it's still playable. Another thing is also to try to reduce friction and make the game playable by the widest audience. Try to have components that can be internationalized. There's no language really required on here. You just do label matching. The local names are used for the locations. And like I mentioned, the cities are double-coded. There's a city finder on the map, so you don't have to feel completely stupid if you don't know where one of the cities is in the world. And the cards are reversible. Basically trying to lay in as much I could into the components. So this is the prototype version, and then the final version in the set. But it's important to note, again, back to iteration and finding the core, that you don't want to do all those enhancements too early. If I were to work up this card immediately, I would be completely married to it. And if any of the rules changed, it would have been difficult to reproduce another whole deck or eliminate the deck completely, right? If I found it was obsolete. So. Basically you get sort of the spark stage, you've got a wireframe stage, and then the final stage. And if you want to make any changes in that last stage, it's really expensive. So, the takeaway here is pretty obvious, right? It's not a great game if you can't play it. This was kind of a fun learning for me in Pandemic. I brought the game a couple years ago to Days of Wonder. I don't know if you guys know of Days of Wonder. So a bunch of great guys over in Los Altos, and I pitched it to them. And it was bad timing because they had just come out with Shadows over Camelot, which is their co-op game. And they're like, well, we kind of already have a co-op game. But they humored me and played the thing because they wanted to see what kind of engine it had in it. And one of the big takeaways I got was that I really wasn't doing a very good job of, quote, embodying the players. They talk about how important it is for you to be able to feel like you're in the game. And at the time, the prototype had 3 gray pawns. It didn't matter how many players were in the game. It could be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Didn't matter. You all collectively shared 3 like pseudo people, and you really couldn't identify with a component. And their suggestion was to find some way to embody folks. And I thought that was good advice. But I also said, well, you've got this great hit game, Ticket to Ride, and what are you telling me that the players are these little train lines? And they acknowledged that I had a point, but they also said that we continue to try to do everything we can to embody the players. And they showed their packaging and pointed out that, even on the packaging, they're basically saying, if you're the yellow person, you got this umbrella, right? Appealing to women here too, right? This is good. And I think they kind of, over time, maybe they abandoned this idea. The Eskimo there really doesn't map to anybody. But point well taken here. And what I ended up doing was introducing the roles there. So not only are the pawns not just gray, but you have your own pawn, which meant I had to redefine a lot of the mechanics of the game. And then now that you could identify with someone, you could layer in special abilities, which were one of the key things in the game for adding variety. I just want to point out, this isn't a new idea, right? This isn't rocket science. Lord of the Rings, cooperative games, got different hobbits with different role abilities. Cosmic did this back in 1977. Dune's a classic that has this concept in it. I just didn't think to put it in my game. Probably just too much work at the time, I thought. So again, takeaway here is people are really going to enjoy themselves a lot more if they feel like they're actually in the game. This is just obvious design advice, right? You want to keep it as simple as you can. I wanted to give one example of this and how the game developed and some of the things I did to simplify it. At one point in the game, you had to deal with quarantines, and there wasn't this idea that you're treating people, you're just quarantining cities, and so you had to add cubes to the board, you had to manage cards, you had actions, cards, cubes. At the end of your turn, you had to decide how many cubes or cards you needed to pick up, and there was different exchange rates, and it was really pretty complex. And what I did was I realized that I had a different kind of commodity, which was an action, and it was like an opportunity cost. And basically took all the stuff on the left there and ran it through a funnel and tried to figure out what's the simplest possible way to make something happen. And so afterward, I ended up with a model where everything in the game takes an action, and at the end of your turn, you just simply draw 2 cards. And this made it much easier to learn the game. But I also want to say that the corollary, that as Einstein said, as simple as possible, but no simpler. I was kind of on the simplicity kick. I was hooked. I was going to try to see how many rules I could reduce, how many components I could throw out. This would be a great game, and it wouldn't have any components. It would be really cheap. To the point where I had everything mapped on this single deck of cards. You use your cards for movement. 3 different kinds of flights you could do. You turn them in to cure the diseases, as I mentioned earlier, and then use that same deck of cards to infect the cities on the board. And I thought this was genius, right? You only got 1 deck of cards, it does everything. And I would play test it with people, and occasionally they would make a mistake, but I was there. I could tell them what they were doing wrong. I didn't really see the problem. And I was testing this on some coworkers, and one of them happened to be a design researcher. And she's like, "Why are you playing? You keep correcting us." I'm like, well, I want you to play the right way so I know if it's working or not. She basically said, just shut up and sit in the corner and watch. And I did, and it was excruciating. It was really painful to watch people because they were, in my mind, they were just making mistakes left and right. And it would have been something if they were making a consistent error, right? If their model of how the game worked it was slightly different than the game model, and they were consistently making the same error, because then I could just map to that. But it was more troubling than that. They were making every kind of variety of error you could think of when it came to the cards. They were drawing from the wrong deck, they were discarding the wrong deck, they were shuffling the wrong things, and I just had to scratch my head. And so I had all this data that something was really broken and people couldn't learn it. And her advice was to introduce an entire new deck of cards. And to me, this was anathema. You want me to introduce 48 new cards into this game? Cards are actually pretty expensive to produce. But as it turned out, the top 4 things all map to player actions, and the bottom one maps to infection. And the simplest answer to the problem that I had was just to split the deck and have 2 special purpose decks. And so again, the players confused the single deck split in 2 piles. The idea was to create 2 special purpose decks. And what that did was it unlocked all sorts of opportunities. Now that there's a clear mental model or a mapping between players and deck A and infection and deck B, I could really enhance those things. I added epidemic cards, I added special action cards, and it really added a lot of richness to the game, despite the fact that I had to add more pieces. So on the left you see a player card, and on the right you see an infection card. I kind of went add as many differences to the cards. So the orientation's different, the pattern's different. You see a disease overlay. One's reversible, one's not. The card backs are different. And after playing this with the new rules, things sailed much more smoothly. So again, the takeaway there, it's great to have a gel of an idea and to have a goal, but unless you kind of observe and shut up and watch people play the thing, you're going to meander around, and just by observing, you're going to get so much richer data. So now that you've got this gel of an idea, and everybody can play it, and they feel like they're in the game, does it mean that it's fun? And I think the short answer is no. It's pretty easy to come up with a set of tasks or a routine that you can put people through. And at the end of the day, why would I want to play that game? So I want to mention a little bit on fun, because you could go through that whole process I described and really have a stinker of a game. My favorite definition of fun comes from Ralph Koster's book, Theory of Fun, and where he basically equates fun with learning. And he says here that fun from games arises out of mastery. It arises out of comprehension. It's the act of solving puzzles that makes games fun. And he says the reason that this is true is that when you solve a problem, your brain basically kicks off some endorphins, and they make you feel good. And basically you could summarize this by saying that good games give you good drugs, and sort of a good design center there. And I wanted to equate that to flow, an idea popularized by, bear with me here, Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi in his book, Flow, The Psychology of Optimal Experience. And I had read some of that, and it was also picked up by Karen Salen and Eric Zimmerman in their really great book. I don't know if you've seen this, but The Rules of Play. They talk about optimal experience in flow, and then they talk about applying that into game design and trying to come up with optimal game experiences. So rather than sort of reiterate what they said, I thought I would take the model of flow that they described and apply it to Pandemic to kind of show you how it works. So basically, the idea is that you can map the game's challenge here on the vertical axis here. You got really hard game up on the top, really easy game on the bottom, and then you got player skill that you can compare it against, sort of newbies on the left and hardcore gamers on the right. And the idea is you want to keep the player in this flow channel where the game's challenge meets the player's skill at all times, so that they're always kind of pushing themselves to go forward. Because if you don't, you start out here, you're not very skilled, and the game may not offer much challenge. But over time, if the game doesn't respond or your opponent doesn't respond, you end up and you're quickly bored. You're out of the channel. Your skill exceeds the game, and why play? It's like the chess grandmaster playing the newbie. There's just nothing there. The reverse is also a problem where if the game is too complex, it creates a lot of anxiety. If any of you are real diehard gamers, you understand this. If you bring out this great game that you just love, and you try to share it with your family, and you show them the 16, 20-page rule book, you're like, I don't want to play that. It creates a lot of anxiety. It's just too challenging for their level of interest. So if you map this into the basic game of Pandemic, by the way, Pandemic ships with 3 different levels of difficulty. There's basic, there's normal, and advanced. And so the idea is when you buy the game, you try it out at the basic level, and the basic level comes with 4 of those really nasty epidemic cards. And so as you're playing, your skill is low, the challenge is low, but as these cards arise, the challenge in the game actually shoots up a bit. And then you've got a period of time, sort of a semi-random interval, where you can kind of cope with the outbreaks on the board, and then you get another kick of problems. And so you're kind of getting a crisis, you're dealing with it, you're getting another crisis, you're dealing with it, getting another crisis, and dealing with it. Then after you've mastered this, you can go into the normal game, and the assumption there is that your skill level is increased, so you're over to the right, which means that the game needs to compensate with more problems. And so you get the 5 epidemic cards there, and again, you stay in that channel because there's enough crisis to keep you anxious enough. So I mean, the whole game is really about creating enough narrative tension that you're engaged, but not too much. And then again, just into the heroic game, you're to the right, and you can just keep carrying this on. So the one worry I had initially was that you could get some really experienced players, and they could play the game, and their skill level would be on the far right, and they play the basic game, and they're just completely bored. You end up with a situation like that. But that seemed like a fair trade-off because they could then, they could ramp up the difficulty and try the game again. There's a replayability option. This seemed much better than, for example, having a really difficult game that you throw at new players where their anxiety goes off the charts, they lose immediately, there's no way to win, they play over and over again, they keep losing, and they put the game away, or they throw it out, or they trash it to their friends. So that was the theory behind that. So flow really isn't enough, though. I mean, you could play a game over and over again, and it could offer a lot of challenge, but if there isn't enough variety, eventually it's going to get stale and you're going to put it away. So one of the things that you really need to pay attention to is the variety of encounter. Basically, does it feel different each time? And some of the things that were baked into Pandemic were, like I mentioned, there's 5 different roles that can come into play, 3 different difficulty levels. You can have a different mix of players, and you always get a different mix of cards. And that helps somewhat that the game doesn't feel stale. But again, even this isn't necessarily enough. One of the other opportunities you can do is build in extensibility into your game. There's some good examples of this. One that comes immediately to mind is, I don't know if you guys have heard of Apples to Apples. If you go to the site, you can download Apples to Apples cards, and you can print them out, and you can make your own cards to add to your game. Well, I didn't really design for that. I could have added like empty roll cards or something like that the players could use. But to my delight, actually, the players actually did that for me. If you go on to Board Game Geek, you can see people are just having a field day with this. There's a US-only board, there's a UK board. At last count, there's something like 24 different special roles that people have invented. It's really, really kind of fun to check that stuff out. And really, this just adds to the variety of encounter. Each game isn't necessarily stale. So I just wanted to end on just say a couple words about cooperative games. One of the things that I really like about them is that they offer different kinds of fun. And these different kinds of fun are actually more appealing to certain people than others. I don't want to appear sexist, but my muse for the game was my wife, Donna. And when I go on to Board Game Geek, it's just so fun to read all the different posts by people saying, this game is spouse-friendly, or this is a game you can play with your kids. And how exciting that is for people that they've got something now that they can connect with their wife with, right? And I think that came from really having a design center for it. And I think it's fun because different folks get to practice different skills. It's not just about survival and being the caveman and beating up what's for dinner that night. It's about interpersonal communication and teamwork, and those, you get a chance to exercise those skills. One of the challenges for designing the game, and I put this together and I started to think, I'm talking at Google. I don't know if this is a challenge or an opportunity. You're putting together a game where the opponent is actually an algorithm. And so if you're really good at designing algorithms, maybe this is the thing for you. So the challenge is trying to keep the game fresh while you're basically playing a computer opponent that is made out of cardboard. On the upside, though, that those types of games can be much easier to play test. I could play many iterations of Pandemic without necessarily trying to draw in friends to play. And if you're a game designer, this is a real issue. People don't necessarily want to play your game 30 times. And you don't want to alienate your friends. So co-ops give you this opportunity to iterate much more often without necessarily wearing out your playtesters. So very, very briefly, I just want to kind of look at what I've just talked about and kind of reflect it back to software design and interaction design, something I practice. One of the things I've observed over and over again is that there's a lot of shared techniques. One of them around product design is, I think this is a key thing to learn, is that rather than starting with this really robust feature set, that you want to focus on the core. What is the essential thing your product really needs to do? And nail that as well as you can. And then start moving outward and adding on other features. Otherwise, again, you end up meandering about. Tireless iteration toward a measurable goal. You just can't iterate enough. You're always trying to take all the friction out of the system. And then as a UED, user experience designer, observation is just key. How do people react to your design and getting that sort of feedback? And lastly, a lot of these are just obvious, right? Making it accessible so you can have the widest audience. While these are shared and interesting to note, I think the more interesting stuff is when you're looking at more inspirational or the more effective side of games. If you look at fun and flow, and you compare that back to interaction design, you begin to ask, how can you use some of those principles to slowly introduce complexity over time? How can you have a really delightful new user experience of the product so that you don't overwhelm essentially the user of that software with a 16-page rulebook, right? You just give them enough so that their brain can lock onto it, and then over time slowly release that. So I do a lot of work on user experience and been doing a lot of thinking around how to unlock those principles. Also, how do you drive engagement? How do you get people coming back over and over again through a variety of encounter, if you will? And this also relates to adaptive interfaces. How does the interface learn over time? Embodiment, I work on social platforms. So when you think of embodiment in a game, you're basically coming up with a token that represents a person in a game or a mediated environment. And when you're looking at social networks or the like, you're basically doing the same thing. You're trying to figure out how do you reflect or represent a participant in a social space by, in this case, a profile. And so some interplay between those two as well. When you think of extensibility of games, allowing other players to add on hooks, I immediately think of application platforms. So you think of Fate or Open Social, different ways that third parties can add components on to add variety and extend what you have and make it more valuable for a longer period of time. And lastly, looking at co-op games, I've had some interesting feedback that while people like the game, they often say, hey, wow, it feels kind of like a meeting. I'm like, oh, God, it's not what I want to hear. They're like, but a really good meeting. So, I started thinking, how can I make my meetings more effective? It's like, well, we got to come up with a solution or the world's going to end, I don't know if that's the answer. But I think there's a lot of overlap between co-op games, and maybe it's just understanding all the above and then applying that to collaborative software, because there's a lot of overlap there as well. And really, that's all I had to say. Thanks. So there's actually a mic up there if anybody wants to ask a question.
Hi there. My name's Ben. You've really taken the best of Lord of the Rings and Arkham Horror and kind of put them together here, and it's really impressive. One of the best parts of cooperative games like those, though, is that you really get to role play. For me, like being Samwise or being, the nun on a Harley with a shotgun in Arkham Horror, it really helps me get into the game. Have you thought about incorporating some of those to make it less like a meeting?
It's a good question. How much theme is appropriate for a game? I think if I wanted to have a more narrative aspect to the game, I could layer in. You could have more rich roles, right? Right now, your role is basically 2 bullet points. You can do A and you can do B. But you could have backstory. You could develop all sorts of things like that to add sort of a more immersive feeling to it. I do think that would add to the play length, though. So it's sort of a trade-off between. Mine is a little bit more Euro style than Ameritrash, if you will. It's sort of a continuum, and I'm always more comfortable in the raw mechanic side. Thanks.
Hi, I noticed that along with your box of Pandemic, you've got a box of something called Outbreak. Is that another game somebody else did entirely? Was it an inspiration, or is that your earlier version?
No, Global Outbreak is a prototype I worked up, and this is actually the set. Here, I'll grab it. This is the set that I pitched to the publishers last April, and it was named Pandemic through the whole development history until I showed it to some publishers, and they're like, I don't know how we would sell that. I mean, it's a game of disease. Who's going to want to buy that for their kid? And so I thought, well, okay, maybe Pandemic is too harsh a title. I'll change it to Global Outbreak. When I found the publishers like, Global Outbreak? You got to name that Pandemic. And, so I guess you can't win. But I like the title Pandemic quite a bit more. I do have the prototype here if anybody wants to take a look at it.
Hey, first of all, I love the game, and all my friends have loved it, and my dad has loved it, and my wife's aunt, and so on and so forth. It's a big success. We're responsible for killing off the whole human race several times. Sorry about that. and for saving the whole human race, but no one ever thanks us. My question is, so I think we all know about the term the long tail, as it applies to music and movies and books and things like that. And your game, as much as it is a great success among enthusiasts of gaming, it's officially in the long tail. You cannot find it on the shelves at Target, for instance.
Right.
It seems to me that in the areas of music, peer-to-peer sharing came along and sort of saved the day for the long tail, and the long tail is pretty healthy. And with books, you can go to Amazon and you can find absolutely anything and get recommendations, and people are reasonably able to find the long tail of books and Netflix for movies and so forth. But with games, like, the situation seems kind of dire to me, because if you look at all of the games, like if you talk to all the people who really love games and they play games a lot, and you look at what are their 200 favorite games, you can hardly find a single one of them at any of your local retailers. Well, yeah, but like normal mom and pop, are not going to go to eBay, right? They're going to go to Target. If you can't find it on the shelves at Target, most people think that it doesn't exist. So the question is just like this really broad one. It's like, how could we fix this problem? Because there's this chicken and egg positive feedback loop where until it's on the shelves at Target, no one will spend millions of dollars on a ad campaign, and until there's an ad campaign, they won't have it on the shelves at Target. Will like high quality, wholesome family entertainment like this ever be able to break into the mainstream? And comment on that.
Yeah, I could give it a shot. I'm not sure there's a problem. I think that different games play to different play styles, and that people that really enjoy the games that require more investment up front, maybe a smaller market than say a party game where the ramp up time is about a minute, right? I mean, Out of the Box does this wonderful job of putting all the rules on the components. You can pull it out and you know how to play just because you're looking at the components. You're like, oh, I pull a card, I read the card, and I can play. There's less social cost involved in trying to get people over and saying, let me teach you this great game. It's only going to take 15 minutes to learn. And those 15 minutes it's a pretty big investment. It may lead to a lot of anxiety. So I think what I would almost describe where we're in right now is this golden age. There's so many different titles out there. You look out there, and you can't keep up. They're not all high quality, but there is a lot of variety. So I don't know. In my opinion, it's really about it's a marketing problem, and if these games with this level of complexity were as good as they are, I think they would almost begin to sell themselves. I don't know, because the players that they appeal to are going to pick them up. Not sure that's like a very complete or satisfying answer, but that's sort of where my head is at with that. I'd love to see more games in different distribution channels. I mean, I think it's great that Starbucks is picking up Cranium, but they're picking up Cranium. It's a party game. It's easy to learn. It's easy to share with your friends. There's less investment. So, I don't know. Take that for what it's worth.
Hi. So I was creating a card game at one point, and I realized, wow, some of these things would have been so much easier if I did it online. And I was wondering, what are some of the, you're talking about friction and things like that. What are the differences between creating a tangible object game as opposed to like something that you just play on the computer game? Like,
Sure.
What are some of those? What have you learned?
Well, one of the key ones, the differences between online and like cardboard or atom-based, if you will, is that I'm in complete control over the whole production process of these things, and I can iterate very, very quickly. As soon as you bring something online, there's all sorts of overhead involved in, I'm not a programmer, so I don't have control over the whole process. So I can put one of these things out and iterate on it much, much faster because I have full control over the whole range of production. The other thing is that there's a whole social factor. I mean, just face-to-face brings so much more value to it. I mean, I play games because they're social to a large extent. I don't play very many online games, although I have to admit that a lot of these things have really mastered flow, and they really suck you in, and that kind of leads to anxiety of a different sort. That I'm going to lose my, I'm not going to have a life anymore. So, I'm playing games for a reason, and part of it is just to be more social. And I don't think that technology is quite there yet, where you can really mediate, or you can really have an experience that feels as close or as close enough to real life. So those are the two answers, I guess.
Tangibility is a great part of it.
Yeah, tangibility, the fact that you can pick it up and feel it. I mean, if you think about Settlers of Catan, the difference between picking up a wooden piece and picking up a cheap plastic piece, there's something there that matters. It's related. Sure.
So I understand that authors will go through a phase where they really get sick of the work they're creating.
Yeah.
Have you ever had that problem with Pandemic or any of your other games?
I was lucky with Pandemic. The core engine I got like right away, and most of it was refinement. And once I started observing, the thing snapped together. So pretty lucky with this one. It only took me 4 years. Other games though, I had a game Lunatic's Loop, a car racing game. You get tired of it and you put it on the shelf and you pull it out again once you have a new idea and then you iterate. Another game that I've been working on, just tentatively called Ants, I'm just sick to death of. I don't want to look at the thing. It's been on the shelf for a couple years. I have a lot of interest in the game, but I can't get myself to pull it down off the shelf. None of my friends will play it. It's a cute game. There's some people who are really, really big fans of it. I just can't get myself to do it. So yeah, absolutely, there are times when you just kind of hate the product you're working on. Dave?
Oh, I like ants, by the way.
Oh, thanks.
So I had questions about how Pandemic solves two kind of fundamental problems that cooperative games face. One of them is the issue of whether and how much players can communicate outside of their actions taken strictly in terms of game mechanics. And the other is the question of the victory conditions, that is whether it's an all-or-nothing victory for the whole group, or whether there's shades of victory where maybe the whole group can lose, or maybe the group wins, but there's actually also an individual or several individual winners within that. So I was wondering how Pandemic deals with those
Sure,
issues.
yeah. The communication one's pretty key. I basically riffed off of Lord of the Rings rule where you could tell your fellow players anything you want about your hand, but you can't show them the cards. And that seems like a really weird rule, but in practice it's pretty good. It means that one player doesn't dominate the whole game. If you get an experienced player playing with a lot of newbies, and they look at the whole setup, they're actually able to calculate and optimize for the whole group, and then the other players really don't have much of a say. And you have that problem of sort of the alpha male kind of taking over and directing people what to do. You can mitigate that to some effect. But I don't think you can completely eliminate it. At least I haven't seen a cooperative game that has completely eliminated it. And the second part of your question was around, partial victory and certain players winning while the team wins. I thought about that. I actually thought about introducing as designed, the players all work together as a team, and you're playing against the game. Well, you could also have a situation where you've got 3 players that are working together, and you've got one player which actually plays the disease. And I thought that might be fun. Shadows over Camelot has that. Other co-ops have that. And I abandoned it right away. I like the feeling, just the positive buzz that you get from all working together. The opponent was hard enough that I didn't need to introduce opponents. And using the same thinking, the partial victory for individuals just seemed like glad handing to people who actually want to do the competitive thing. So I kind of just did a pure co-op, and it felt good about that. It was just pure.
I also thought of a character or a role who's like the egotistical researcher who still helps everybody but collects like glory points every time he cures a disease, and can sort of have some tension there. But I haven't tried that. Question is, do you have new games that are coming out soon? Anything you can tell us about?
Yeah, I just signed on a new game last week. So thanks. Hopefully you'll see it in the fall. It's a dice game, and that one took me 2 months. So it's called To Be Named Yet. We'll see. Yeah.
You mentioned some of the mutations that Pandemic has seen in Board Game Geek, the new roles and the alternate boards. Is that something that you're interested in? Are you interested in mutating the game further, or are you content where it's sitting?
There has been some interest in potentially doing an expansion. I'm not one who is real excited about expansions. I think it's partly because I only have so much space to save games, and they eat up a lot of room. But I have given it some thought, and I think basically my criteria is that I'll consider an expansion if I get enough time to play test it, where I'm really, really happy with the additional roles or whatever else we'd want to package in. Because I think it would be fun it could bring some new life into the game. So if you played it quite a few times, if you get a pack of 5 or 6 or 10 new roles, I mean, that just opens up all sorts of new doors for replayability. So right. I'm open to it.
Yeah, I had a temptation with my children of painting a set of the research stations a different color and having two different teams competing to save the world.
Oh, that's interesting.
But
Okay.
I can keep going. I don't know how much time do we have.
We have a couple more minutes.
This is my favorite subject, so I'll just ask questions. My other question was going to be, somebody saved me because I forgot. What's my other question? What are your other favorite games? Thank you.
Other favorites. I'm really partial to Tigris and Euphrates. I think it's got a really great tight set of rules, fairly tight set of rules, but I just haven't worn it out yet. Every time I play it, I see all sorts of new possibilities and combinations. I used to be a huge fan of Settlers. I'm starting to kind of trail off on that. It's a great gateway game, great way to introduce your family to games. But now when I have that opportunity, I usually pull out Pandemic. Those are two that just spring to mind right away.
I remembered my question.
Okay.
So what was the whole experience like of trying to pound the pavement, talking to all the publishers and convince one of them to take your game? And then when Z-Man took your game, what was the whole process like of working with them, and how does that kind of work from the designer's perspective?
Yeah. I think that the hardest part was kind of breaking in, and I think there's a temptation by a lot of designers to just do it yourself because you don't feel like you can find someone to publish for you. So in 2000, I actually did that. I published Lunatic's Loop, and I did 200 sets, and it was nightmarish trying to put that together. I don't know if you've seen that game, but it's got a lot of bits in it. And so I was planning my wedding and putting the loop together, and it was just kind of crazy. I tacked on a trip to Essen onto the end of the honeymoon, if that gives you any kind of indication. So anyway, probably says too much about myself. So that's really not terribly effective, but what it did do is it allowed me to meet a lot of people. I met a lot of publishers, and I got invited to the Gathering of Friends, which was just wonderful. So last year, I went back to the Gathering and had this fairly polished prototype. It was the second year that it appeared at the Gathering, and I had done refinements based on feedback from those folks that had given me feedback, and it was sort of a hit. I think I had 5 different publishers interested. So I don't know. I think part of it is just having access, and the other part is just having a good product. So once I decided which publisher to go with, things went fairly straightforward with Z-Man. They didn't request, Zev's really wonderful to work with, didn't request any rules changes. We talked about a few of them, but I had literally control over, I was reviewing the rules down to the punctuation in the rules. So it was a really great working relationship with Zev. Most of it, just email communication back and forth. Worked with a painter out of France. His last name's Moulin, I think. I'm probably butchering the pronunciation there. He did the underpainting for the board, and he did the roll artwork. And I was able to approve different versions of that. The original box top needed a lot of refinement, and we ended up. I tried to get a nice heroic figure, sort of positive imagery. You didn't want burning bodies on the cover because people. I got some burning bodies the first time, and got a big positive female role model right on the front. So that was sort of what I was looking for. And then worked with Josh Capel, who did a lot of the graphic design. I was really happy with that. It was kind of like Christmas every time I opened up an email and getting a new version of the visual design. Like I said, I'm an interaction designer. I'm actually a visual designer by trade, but this just isn't going to move units. He did a good job on the visual design of it. Other questions?
How large were sales?
The question was, how large are sales? So the initial run was 3,000 units, and we sold them out at distributors in like 4 weeks.
Is there another run right now?
Question is there another run? We're expecting games to be in stores in 2 or 3 weeks, so mid-May. Yeah.
How do you go about balancing the difficulty? Is it modeling? Is it watching players, or are you playing a lot of time?
Question was, how do you balance difficulty? Modeling, watching people, or playing myself, right? And I think the answer is sort of yes. A little bit less on the modeling. I mean, you can build up all these theoretical models for how it should work, and you need to do some of that in order to get a prototype put together. That's reasonable. But in practice, the proof is in the play. And you do need to do a mix, I think, of observation and playing yourself. If you're just observing, you don't really necessarily get a feel for, is this enjoyable or not. Okay, great, thanks.